recorded. At the end of the assembly, students should make use of the QR code to confirm your attendance as well as to express your opinions of this assembly. Students can check your attendance record at My Event on the registration and attendance system after 4 p.m. on the third working day after the biweekly assembly. The 667th Assembly of New Asia College of CUHK in 2023 to 2024 starts now. This assembly is jointly organized by the Qian Wu Lecture in History and Culture. And we are so honored to have Professor Martin Kern, Professor in Asian Study, Princeton University, to share with us on his topic of the voice of historian in early China. We are also pleased to have Professor Wiki Zhe, Professor from Department of History, the Chinese University of Hong Kong, to introduce the speaker. Professor Zhe, please.
Professor Kern, colleague, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the second session of the Qian Wu Lecture in History and Culture. Our speaker today is Professor Martin Kern. He is the Joanna and Greg 84 P13 P18 Select Professor in Asian Studies. He is one of the leading scholars on the study of early China. He published extensively in the field of early Chinese literature, philosophy, history, and culture. And if you want to know more about his publication, then you can check up in the booklet. But I have to say, I'm so privileged to be here to introduce Professor Kern to you, because since the early days that I was a graduate student, I found many of Professor Kern's works are important reference to my own research. And I see that many colleges share my point of view. And along his scholarship, Professor Kern also makes great contribution to the academic community. He serves as co-editor of the prestigious philological journal, Tongbao, and is a member of the American Philosophical Society and also the current president of the American Oriental Society. At Princeton, Professor Kern also directs the university-wide collaboration, namely Comparative Antiquity, a Humanities Council global initiative, and also so many projects and initiatives across the world. I promised Professor Kern to make the introduction short so that we can save more time for his lecture. So the topic of this lecture today is the voice of the historian in early China. And please join me to give our warmest welcome to Professor Kern.
Thank you very much, Professor Zhe, for this very kind introduction. Thank you all for being here. This is the largest live audience I've ever spoken to. I'm very privileged to be here to deliver this year's Qian Wu Lectures, especially on the anniversary of the Chinese University of Hong Kong, the 60th university. It's really one of the greatest honors of my career. I have a script which I will read. Normally it is better to speak freely, but I find it difficult to control the time if I do that, so please bear with me while I go through my manuscript. The voice of the historian in early China is something I have been working on recently in several papers. And it follows, to some extent, quite naturally from my talk 2 days ago on authorship in early China. So those who had a chance to be there will notice that, especially at the beginning, I pick up a few of the threads that I left dangling 2 days ago. Okay, let's get started. The voice of the historian defines our relationship with historical writing and with history itself. It is from this voice that historical writing attains not only its authorship, but also its authority and credibility. Consider how the two preeminent historians in ancient Greece begin their works. And I quote, "Here are presented the results of the inquiry carried out by Herodotus of Halicarnassus. The purpose is to prevent the traces of human events from being erased by time, and to preserve the fame of the important and remarkable achievements produced by both Greeks and non-Greeks. Among the matters covered is, in particular, the cause of the hostilities between Greeks and non-Greeks." Or, Thucydides of Athens wrote this history of the war fought against each other by the Peloponnesians and the Athenians. He began his work at the outbreak, reckoning that this would be a major war and more momentous than any previous conflict. There were two grounds for this belief. Both sides were at the full height of their power and their resource for war. And he, so this is Thucydides speaking of himself in the third person, and he saw the rest of the Greeks allying with one or the other, either immediately or in intent. And even before these two most famous Greek historians, there is Hecataios of Miletos, of whose work we only have fragments. And he also begins like this. Hecataios of Miletos thus speaks, "I write what I deem true, for the stories of the Greeks are manifold and seem to me ridiculous." All three historians claim to recall the past reliably, unlike the earlier poets like Homer, whom they accuse of fanciful, often unbelievable storytelling of remote events. Just as Hecataios says, it seems ridiculous what you hear from these earlier poets. All three of them introduce themselves with their name and place of origin in the very first words of their texts. The very first word of each of these three texts is the name of the historian. There is nothing before that name. Yeah? The second word is the place where the person comes from. And yet they are all speaking in the third person. They don't say I, they say he. And then lending her voice an objective, authoritative aura. However, the voice of the historian can be configured and represented in a much wider range of ways, on the extended scale from the intensely personal to the purely institutional. In pre-modern China, various models existed at different times, from the impersonal accounts of Zuo Zhuan and Guo Yu in the Warring States to the voice of Sima Qian in the early empire, to the Imperial State Office of Historiography, the Shiguan, established under the Tang in the 7th century, to the personal interventions of Ouyang Xiu in the 11th century to rewrite not only one, but two official imperial histories, the Qin Tang Shu and the Xin Wu Dai Shi, and so forth. Altogether, for some 2,500 years, historiography has been one of the weight-bearing pillars of Chinese writing and of Chinese culture altogether. This is remarkable and unusual. There are not many ancient traditions around the world that developed historiography in such broad and critically central ways. Today I wish to take a closer look at Sima Qian, who is often called the father of Chinese historiography or the Chinese Herodotus. Nobody has called Herodotus the Greek Sima Qian. I think we have to change that. So, how is this voice represented in the Shiji, or the records of the historian. To begin, there exists a fundamental contradiction between a unified idea of the Sima Qian persona, and persona in Greek means mask. It's not the real face, it's the mask in front of that face. There is a contradiction between a unified idea of the Sima Qian persona and the actual shape of the Shiji. If we look especially at the biographies, the Liezhuan chapters, which are Sima Qian's principal invention in writing history, we find quite a number of them highly incoherent, that is, poorly patched together from different sources and without an actual narrative structure. And I mentioned already 2 days ago, prime examples are the most famous historical figures. Kongzi, Laozi, Qu Yuan. Try to read these biographies and try to make sense of them. You will not find a coherent narrative. So, why do readers accept these narratives? Readers accept these chapters precisely because they are so imperfect. It shows that these texts were not newly created by Sima Qian, but compiled from earlier documents that are then poorly stitched together. And so it is the very lack of coherence that makes these source materials credible. At the same time, many scholars have claimed for the Shiji a single unifying grand plan that they then attribute to Sima Qian, plus some parts to his father, Sima Tan, and then some later contributors to the project after Sima Qian's death. But how is this unity constructed? This is what I want to talk about. So we start out with Sima Qian as a textual persona. Claims for unity depend on taking the Sima Qian persona as the mastermind of the Shiji. This persona is primarily derived from 3 sources, all of them external to the narrative proper. The final auto postface of the Grand Lord Archivist, the Taishigong Zixu, that is chapter 130 of the Shiji, then Sima Qian's letter to Renan, and then the Taishigong Yue statements that are affixed to all but 2 chapters of the Shiji. And these are the 2 chapters that are missing the Taishigong comments. It is through these 3 paratextual sources, all of them attributed to Sima Qian himself, that the Shiji is tied to the Sima Qian persona, and that we actually know something about Sima Qian as a historical person. Michael Nyland, she is a professor at Berkeley, professor of early Chinese history. Michael Nyland has called the letter an act of literary impersonation, a praiseworthy attempt to convey through an epistolary fiction genuine truths about Sima Qian's imagined state of mind. Unquote. In this reading, Sima Qian is not the author of the letter, but he is impersonated and staged as that author. And then we don't know who wrote the letter. Yet given the centrality of the letter in defining Sima Qian's motives for writing the Shiji, we must go further and extend that staging to the voice of Sima Qian as the historian and author of the Shiji altogether. It is only through this staging that the Shiji becomes legible in the particular way that is familiar to modern readers, where we read the Shiji as a document of not only of history, but also of Sima Qian's personal experiences and emotions. Thus, the text becomes defined by its paratext, by these 3 textual elements that surround the text. It is interpreted from the margins inward. Perhaps the historical Sima Qian created this textual persona that we call Sima Qian, and that appears in the letter and the auto postface. Or perhaps someone else did. Either way, this textual persona through which we read Shiji is a representation of the historical Sima Qian as the voice of the historian. It is not the voice of the historical person. Thus, when in the following I say Sima Qian, I mean only that textual persona and voice. I do not ask whether Sima Qian created the Shiji. In fact, I have no answer to that. I have nothing to say about that question. I only ask how the Shiji's paratextual materials created the Sima Qian voice. The letter to Renan, as noted by Li Weiyi, who gave the Qianmu lecture, I believe, 2 years ago, she is a good friend at Harvard. The letter to Renan, according to Li Weiyi, carries the momentum of voice. Its recurrent concern is the choice of speaking or not speaking, the conditions of utterance and silence, and how both can be recognized or misunderstood, unquote. This concern manifests itself in two interrelated sets of statements. The first about Sima Qian himself, the second about earlier authors, especially in the famous catalogue of suffering authors that we find in both the letter and the postface. I'm not going to read this entire section here, but this is a very, very famous passage in the Shiji where Sima Qian describes how people who were not authors at all, but who were sages, who were philosophers, who were thinkers, became authors out of suffering and despair. And of course, he inscribes himself into this list at the very end, following this passage. So in a word, this is his intellectual genealogy. These are his forefathers. Here, just as in the great preface, the Daxu, to the classic of poetry, the Shijing, authorship is portrayed not as volitional, but as inevitable. The text, and with it the figure of the author, arises only in response to personal suffering. Paradoxically, it is the loss of control over one's voice that lends the author not only credibility, but ultimate, unquestionable authority. Textual composition is not, with Aristotle, a technical art of making, or poiesis, of which our modern word poetry is derived, the thing that is made. It is, in early China, a quasi-cosmological event that occurs on its own terms, not as the result of authorial manipulation of knowledge, of language. The authentic and truthful author, according to the catalogue that we see here, becomes an author only by the force of his pain, and he cannot but speak. Parce Plato, he does not know how to lie. This is how the textual persona of Sima Qian is portrayed, or self-portrayed, in the paratextual framework of Shiji, transformed from suffering subject to heroic historian. Now let's look at the Taishi Gongyue comments that are attached to each chapter, and this is the core of my lecture today. As a paratextual feature, the Taishi Gongyue comments run through the Shiji from beginning to end. As I mentioned a moment ago, they're included in all but 2 chapters, the exceptions being chapter 22, the table of generals and famous ministers since the rise of the Han, and chapter 48, the hereditary house of Chenshe. Typically, the Taishi Gongyue comments are placed at the end of each chapter, but sometimes also at the beginning, or somewhere in the middle. We also find a narrator's voice elsewhere, in all kinds of exclamations, rhetorical questions, and other emotional expressions, but this voice is not explicitly marked. The perception is chapter 61, the biography of Boyi, the Boyi Liezhuan, that programmatically opens the Liezhuan section and raises fundamental questions about how to know history, how to write history, and how to understand its moral principles, that is, the way of heaven, Tian Dao. The Taishigong comments deserve particular attention because they are explicitly marked as statements of one individual and presumably single voice. Since at least the 7th century, this voice has been understood as Sima Qian's, beginning with Zhang Shoujie's commentary after the very first of the Taishigong statement, the one that is attached to the very first chapter of the entire Shiji, the basic annals of the 5 thearchs, the Wu Di Ben Ji. And here you see the Taishigong Yue statement, and then followed in smaller characters the 8th century commentary that explains what is meant by Taishigong Yue. And this is this commentary. The Grand Lord Archivist, that's Taishigong, is Sima Qian's self-appellation. The auto-postface states, the Grand Lord Archivist said, the former man mentioned. And further, the Grand Lord Archivist said, I have heard it from Master Dong. And further, the Grand Lord Archivist encountered the calamity of the Liling affair. So this connects Sima Qian to the events of the time, to his father and to his teacher. It is clear that the Grand Lord Archivist is Sima Qian's giving a title to himself. There are also other opinions, of course, at that time, but this here is good evidence if we accept that the auto-postface to which the commentary refers is Sima Qian's own writing. But is the title Grand Lord Archivist, Taishigong, how Sima Qian refers to himself, considering that the title signifies high status and hence an honorific form of address? Doubts about this were voiced already in Han times, as noted in another commentary from the Tang, and there were various different alternatives offered. There exists no proof either way what Taishigong refers to, but it seems improbable that Sima Qian would have called himself Taishigong. You cannot call yourself something like the great master of history, right? Perhaps a later editor inserted the formula to replace a more modest phrase, such as maybe Qian Yue, Sima Qian de Qian Yue. Or perhaps this later editor wrote all these Taishigong Yue comments together, impersonating Sima Qian and making Sima Qian say what he should have said. Note that often the Taishigong statements seem rather unrelated to the material in the chapters they talk about. And I give you some examples later. And note further that all the chapters that we know since Han times that were added or replaced by later editors or scholars over the time, and so these chapters clearly do not come from Sima Qian, but they all have Taishigong Yue comments. For example, the famous 10 lost chapters that Eastern Han scholars talk about and identify in the Shiji, where they say it has a title, but there is no text. And then, of course, in the Shiji that we have, there is text, which means that text is from somebody later. These comments, these Taishigong Yue comments, could not have been written by Sima Qian, but in their diction, in their form, they are entirely in line with all the others. This should not shock us, because there is a long tradition of adding impersonal comments. Just think, for example, of Zhongni Yue or Kongzi Yue comments in Zhuozhuan, all of which were added centuries after Confucius's death. Nobody believes that when you read in Zhuozhuan Kongzi Yue, that this is actually Kongzi speaking. The Taishigong statements are loaded with expressions of raw emotion. They include 54 instances of the first-person pronoun yu. And this is a special first-person pronoun. This is the emotive first-person pronoun. When somebody gets really emotional, they use yu. They don't say wu, they don't say wo, and so on. They say yu, right? So 54 times. And then we have, and often these express then not just personal thought and feelings, but feelings of suffering or thoughts of discontent. And it is distinguished, this personal pronoun, it's distinguished from the neutral wu or the plural wo. Wu also appears now 16 times. Wu appears, as you see here. But in most of these cases, they are not about emotional statements. They are matter-of-fact-like statements where the speaker visited a place or just twice says that he has heard something from someone. There are also 36 rhetorical question markers. Qi, how, right? How could it be? In a question or exclamation, and very often as qi bu or qi fei, how not? How could it not be like this? Right? Then there are 46 initial conjunctions, he, 27 exclamation markers, zai, 43 final questions, hu. There are 10 cases of kuang, even more so, right? And 12 of bei, to pity, to grieve, 7 times as bei fu, how pitiful. If this is the voice of the historical Sima Qian, and you can clearly hear here a human voice, right? If this is the voice of the historical Sima Qian, we must conclude that whenever he got emotional, he spoke in repetitive and predictable formulas. He sighs, he cries, he pities, he emphasizes his subjectivity with the pronoun you, and he cannot stop asking rhetorical questions and uttering exclamations of doubt and frustration, all expressed through a limited vocabulary and formulaic language. The voice of this Tai Shi Gong is highly ritualized and constructed. Obviously, this voice is thus only seemingly personal or individual. Instead, it is exemplary. This is how a good historian understands and speaks about history. In some ways, although very differently, as I will show you in a moment, it is a voice that follows the tradition of the nobleman, the Junzi Yue comments in Zhuozhuan and in some other texts. Like the Tai Shi Gong, the Junzi is not individual but institutional, an exemplary person in which is staged not a particular historical individual, but the personified model of historical judgment, a model for future generations to appreciate and to emulate. Its expression of judgment is never idiosyncratic. It's exemplary. This is how a good historian must speak. One aspect that distinguishes the Tai Shi Gong from the earlier Junzi, however, is that the former, the Tai Shi Gong, expresses deep emotionality. The Junzi never does. The Junzi never cries. The Junzi not even sighs. Yet we must not misread the Tai Shi Gong statements as subjective or individual. The concept of emotion in early China is quite complicated and is something quite different. Not subjective, but intersubjective. Not one person's response to the world, but any perceptive, moral human being's response. This is abundantly clear from how emotion is treated in early texts, including in the preface to the Shi Jing. And from the very term qing that is used there, that in early China denotes not just feelings or passions, as it does today, but also facts, or the essence, or human disposition. You have this you have remnants of this in the modern Chinese language when you say xing qing, for example. Yeah, this has nothing to do with emotion. It's the facts of the matter. Qing xing. Yeah. So this is what I call exemplary. The emotions of the Tai Shi Gong are what they should be under the circumstances. They mark the speaker as a deeply perceptive historian, but also instruct the reader on how to think and how to feel. These statements, therefore, are rules-based, performed, and staged. Like the nobleman comments in Zhuan, they are representational and didactic. They are representational in how they display the voice of the ideal historian, and they are didactic in how they guide the audience to understand history. While the nobleman and Confucius comments in Zhuan and the Taishigong comments in Shiji both represent the same rhetorical feature of a constructed paratext that stands outside of the narrative proper, in their substance they're very different. Only with Sima Qian, the role of the historian is personalized. In both Zhuan and Shiji, the paratextual statements signal truth and authority, but they're based on very different sets of presumptions regarding the role and identity of the historian as an author. There are other elements in the Taishigong statements that are related to authority and truth. Consider the three activities that appear with high frequency in these comments, and always with the Taishigong voice as the subject: to read, du, to observe, guan, and to hear, wen. We are shown how the Taishigong perceives the world by way of reading, observing, and hearing. He is presented as a reader, an observer, a listener, and only as a result of all of this, as a writer. There is no writer who is not first a reader. In the Shiji, Confucius himself is presented 3 times as a reader who is then also a historian. In chapter 47, the Kongzi Shijia, in the Taishigong statement that opens chapter 121, the Rulin Liezhuan, and then in another statement to chapter 13, the Sandai Shibia. You see these here. All 3 mentions are formulaic. In the first 2 cases as, quote, Kongzi relied on historical records to create the Springs and Autumns Annals, Yin Shiji, Zuo Chunqiu, which in the third is just slightly adjusted to Kongzi relied on historical writings to arrange the Springs and Autumns Annals in the right order. So, Kongzi in Shiwen Zi Chunqiu. Compared to the 17 passages that show the Taishigong reading in these Taishigong Yu comments, there are only, in the entire Shiji, in the entire book, 32 other passages where anybody else is reading. And we know that probably at least 8 of them are from later generations. So nobody in the Shiji reads as much as Sima Qian. Nobody is shown as consistently as Sima Qian to be a reader first before anything else. Now, reading, sighing, crying. Twice do the Taishigong comments represent him, the speaker, as a reader who discerns an earlier author from his texts. First, when reading the writings of Master Kongzi, I see him in my thoughts as the person he was. 详见其为人. When reading, and then the second one, when reading Li Sao Tianwen, Zhao Hun, and Ai Ying, I grieve over Qu Yuan's purpose. Having traveled to Changsha and seen where Qu Yuan had drowned himself in the abyss, I never can help shedding tears, and I see him in my thoughts as the person he was. Unquote. So despite the display of personal emotion marked by the pronoun yu, the 2 comments are formulaic and impersonal. Both start with when reading, when I read, yu du, and they both end with I see him in my thoughts as the person he was, 想见其为人. Similarly, the Taishigong comments on Guanzhong, Yanyin, and Shangyang state how reading their writings leads the Taishigong to examining and describing their lives. I read Master Guan's Shepherding the People and other pieces, and further Master Yan's Springs and Autumns, how detailed they are in laying things out. Having seen their compositions, I wanted to survey how they conducted their affairs and therefore arranged their biographies. Or about Shangyang, I once read Lord Chang's writings on opening up barriers and plowing and warfare, which are similar to how, as a person, he conducted his affairs. The ill fame he finally gained in Qin, there was indeed a reason for that. Remarkably, neither the joint biography of Guanzhong and Yanyin, nor the one devoted to Shangyang, mention any of their texts. It's only in the Taishe Gongyue statements where these are portrayed as authors, as writers. The formula Yudu is the preferred phrase in the Taishe Gong comments, appearing 12 times, while 4 times, all in the introductions to one of the tables, the Biao, which are very impersonal, the act of reading is attributed to the Taishe Gong in the 3rd person. 3 times in these passages, we encounter the formula, I never can help but push the writing away and sigh. Twice we read, I never can help but have my tears streaming down. You see the Chinese text up there. Or, I never can help but shed tears. And once the Taishe Gong states that I never can help but push the writing away and cry. Only once is I read expressed with the neutral, that is, non-emotive first-person pronoun wu. Moreover, the Taishe Gong comments never mention the historian's reading of the first 12 chapters, the basic annals, the annals of the ancient rulers all the way to Hanudi's own ruler. In sum, both the act of reading and the emotional responses of sighing and crying are described in repetitive formula, and they are limited to particular chapters of the Shiji, to particular sections. As a reader in the Liezhuan section, the biography, the Taishe Gong is extremely consistent. And as this reader responds with insight and emotion to what he reads, so should later readers of the Shiji read the work of the historian. The Taishe Gong comments present a model for how to read, which is exactly the concern with posterity that is explicitly expressed in the letter to Ren'an and attributed also to Confucius in the biography of Confucius in the Shiji. So what Sima Qian is doing here, he presents himself looking at history, looking at texts, looking at the facts, presenting his response to that, and by that setting up a model for the future. It is based on the model of the ancestral sacrifice, if you think about it, in ancient China, where when a person sacrifices in the ancestral temple to their parents, right, they not only speak toward their parents as spirits, they also speak to their own future descendants by showing themselves as exemplary filial followers of their parents. And this is how they want to be treated by their descendants. It is the same model that Sima Qian uses here when talking about texts. He is the junction between the past and the future. Now, observing, hearing, and judging. Much more than by reading, the knowledge of the Taishe Gong is informed by what he has observed, guan, and heard, wen, with each term appearing about 24 times. Especially guan deserves attention. Guan does not simply mean to observe or to watch or to see. It means to observe something with deep and comprehensive insight, understanding and judgment. It can veer toward to contemplate, to meditate upon. Unlike other terms signifying visual perception, guan denotes a position of mental sovereignty. What is being observed is completely at the perceptive observer's disposal. Thus, when in Zuozhuan, the prince Jijia of Wu in 544 BCE visits the court of Lu, he requests to guan the music of Zhou and is then treated to a performance of poetry, song, and dance. He does not simply observe the music in terms of seeing it, of a visual and auditory multimedia spectacle. He observes it from an elevated position of moral and political judgment, and then he comments after each part of the performance perspicaciously on the singing and dancing, complete with predictions for the different polities that are associated with these different sections of the Shijing. Another meaning of Guan, by the way, is to divine, Zhan. So you see that this word Guan that Sima Qian uses for all sorts of his observing, has also quasi-religious implications. Throughout the Shiji, historical actors are described as people who also do Guan. They Guan what? They Guan virtue, De. They Guan the mandate of heaven, Tianming. They Guan the models of high antiquity, Shanggu. The merits and achievements of the former thearchs, Xiandi Gongye. They Guan somebody's mind, Xin, or inner disposition, Nei. Local customs, Feng, or government, Zheng. All things that actually cannot be seen, if you think about it. The same gesture of sovereignty of perception appears in the Taishigong comments. Likewise, Wen is much more than just to hear in the sense of accidentally overhearing something. To have heard something means to have learned something. That is either from a figure of authority, for example, one's teacher, or about some situation from the past. To have heard something is therefore akin to have understood it. Zhi, which is another crucial term in the vocabulary of historical inquiry and judgment. Zhi doesn't mean to know, Zhi means to understand. Now, what does the Taishigong observe and hear? First, there's the observing of texts. In chapter 1 of Chunqiu and Guoyu, in chapter 12 of the words of the masters of methods and sacrificial shrine officials, which is a slight variation of the comment in chapter 28. Then in chapter 27 of the Shiji, he Guan's historical records. In chapter 60, brilliant phrases. In all of these cases, observe is not the right word, because since the Taishigong uses du, to read, so frequently, Guan in these cases is not to observe or look, but to observe something from the text, that is, to understand something from it. And here's another major difference to the nobleman comments in Zhuozhuan. The nobleman not only says something, like the Taishigong introduced with yue, so it's junzi yue instead of Taishigong yue. Zhuozhuan also uses the formula junzi shi yi zhi. Because of this, the nobleman understands, which appears in Zhuozhuan 11 times, and mostly as a prediction that signals a future consequence. This formula never occurs in the Taishigong comments. The Taishigong never makes a prediction. The 36 times when zhi, to understand, appears by the Taishigong, it always refers to factual knowledge. Now, the other uses of Guan in the Taishigong are related to specific matters. He Guans the changes in the ritual system of the dynasties of antiquity, the celestial images or figures, the stars, the constellations. He Guans irrigation work, he Guans the ritual paraphernalia in the Confucius temple. He Guans the place where Qu-Yuan had drowned himself. He Guans ancient walls, fortifications, or old houses. In most of these cases, Guan is related to the Taishigong's travel. He travels to examine specific objects and circumstances. But during his travel, Guan also signifies to contemplate or imagine what is no longer visible. such as the political chaos in former times, in chapter 33, the actions of Guanzhong and Yanyin that we just saw, the righteousness of one figure, or the ways in which ancient generals had attracted worthies. In all these dimensions, the action of Guan marks the historian's qualities and trustworthiness. He personally visits important locations to gather his information about the past, and he examines or contemplates the real or imagined traces of history. Similarly, what he has heard establishes some degree of credibility, though with less certainty. On occasion, the Taishigong has heard some information from somebody, or something that an earlier person had once said, such as Confucius, but often he simply has heard something about the past, which twice he finds confusing, and he says, "Strange indeed is what one hears. 意在所闻." And finally, there is what has been heard from the olden days, 旧闻, in chapter 14, where it is paired with records of the archivists, the historical sources, 史记, an expression that gestures at an earlier but somewhat dubious source. In short, hearsay is marked as just hearsay, which once again proves the historian's judicious treatment of the past. He tells you, I'm hearing these things, but I don't believe everything I hear. Yeah. This is important. In presenting his credibility, the Taishigong thus puts a premium on what he has read and what he has observed, while what he has heard can serve to prove his ability to doubt things. To have read points at his collection and examination of written sources. To have observed is often related to his travels, where he ascertains the truth of history by visiting its locations, or where nothing is left to see, it signals the reflection and contemplation on the past that is the historian's imagination and insight. Guan refers to both close verification and deep insight. What further distinguishes both observing and reading from hearing is that they are direct actions by the Taishigong, while hearing is merely the reception of information from others, not initiated or controlled by the historian. The mental capacity of reflection and contemplation of Guan is centrally important, even when it refers to visiting places, talking to people, examining physical remnants from the past. The Taishigong is not some wide-eyed tourist, randomly pointing his camera or his iPhone at things that he sees, nor are his findings accidental. He knows exactly what he's looking for. He already knows what he might find. In observing, he makes sense of what he sees. He interprets and judges both what he sees and even what he can no longer see. The representation of judgment is my final point here. All historiography is constructed not just of narratives, but of a cause and effect logic in order to be meaningful and plausible. There is no such thing as just the facts. It is, in other words, driven by judgment. But judgment needs justification. In Zhuozhuan, judgment is constantly expressed by the historical actors themselves, explicitly or in more subtle ways. As my friend David Scarberg at the University of California at Los Angeles has shown in this marvelous book that's already more than 20 years old, one of the best books in my field, in fact. As David Scarberg has shown, Zhuozhuan trains its readers to make sense of the historical account and to accept Zhuozhuan as truthful. Unlike in Greco-Roman historiography, there is no authorial voice to take responsibility for the account, to claim trust and credibility as Herodotus and Thucydides do, or to lay out the principles of judgment. In Zhuan, this function is primarily lodged in the speeches of the historical actors themselves, and is also transposed then to paratextual comments by the nobleman. Yet these comments are merely sporadic and unevenly distributed. Most of the judgment of history in Zhuan is from the historical actors within the narrative, not from the historian. In Shiji, by contrast, the Taishigung comments are supplied systematically, as I said, from beginning to end. They mark the historian's voice and persona as highly personal and emotional, yet also mark his account as factual, based on his written sources and travels. The comments are laced with expressions of judgment and causality. There are 91 gu, therefore, sometimes also as reason. There are 19 shi, because of this, for this reason. There are 3 dozen zhi, understand, understood. 48 fei, something is not the case, he says. And another 13 times where he expresses uncertainty, gai, probably. Several key passages in the Taishigung comments explicitly discuss these methods, and they are strategically placed throughout the Shiji. And this point is important. The Taishigung comment at the end of chapter 1 that I showed you at the very beginning, the first of the basic annals, succinctly notes the efforts and doubts of earlier scholars, including Kongzi and his followers. It mentions the historian's personal travels, it mentions his principal written sources, while also allowing that not all information is consistent or equally trustworthy. So that's in chapter 1. The first Taishigung comment lays out all the principles. Then in the comment at the beginning of chapter 13, which is the first of these tables in Shiji, the genealogical tables, the Taishigung praises Confucius for being circumspect when, quote, transmitting as doubtful what was in doubt. Yi ze chuan yi. If you don't know it, you have to transmit it as something that you don't know. You cannot just say, I know it. And finally, in chapter 61, which is the first of the biographies, the Boi Liezhuan, the Taishigung explores the difficulties in ascertaining historical truth, reading and questioning both his sources and traditional authority, resolving moral dilemmas in writing history. Together with the final chapter of the Shiji, chapter 130, the postface, chapter 61 is the frame of the biographical section as a whole. These programmatic statements at the beginning of the basic annals, the tables, and the biographies serve as weight-bearing pillars in the architecture of the Shiji as a whole. They are not randomly placed. They are where they are for a purpose. Coming now almost to the end of my lecture, let me briefly add some depth to the comparison with the nobleman comments in Zhuan. To further highlight how the Taishigung statements in their principal concerns, methods, and choices of style and diction differ profoundly and systematically from those of the nobleman. And the fact that they are different consistently shows that both are constructed systematically. In their basic function, both are paratextual voices of judgment and authority, evaluating history not only as a sequence of events, but as a meaningful semiotic system, a system of signs. And yet they differ in every possible way. The Taishigung reads, the nobleman does not. The nobleman cites lines from the canonical Shijing poetry. The Taishigung never quotes the Shijing. The nobleman, in evaluating historical events and actions, places accordance with ritual propriety, Li, at the center of his concerns. But Li plays no role at all in the comments of the Taishigong. The Taishigong travels, investigates, talks to people to ascertain facts. The nobleman stays put. He never travels. Wherever his embodied voice might be located, he is in one place, and he only comments on the text. The nobleman predicts the future consequences of current actions. The Taishigong shows no interest in prediction. The Taishigong is both intensely emotional and keen on his observing. The nobleman knows neither how to sigh or cry or to observe. The nobleman falls into tetrasyllabic rhythms of speech, the traditional rhythm of Shijing poetry. The Taishigong indulges in questions and exclamations. In sum, everything that seems centrally important to one voice is completely absent in the other. Each represents its own distinct and consistent voice of authority based on a defined set of actions, concerns, and expressions. And that shows you that both are constructed and not just individual. To summarize, I do not ask about the historical Sima Qian's role in writing either the Shiji or the Taishigong comments. I have nothing to say on that. Instead, I observe that the paratextual Taishigong persona is highly stylized, constructed, and performative in his expressions. It follows its rules, procedures, and formulaic ways of speaking, including those to signal personal emotion. Personal emotion is not expressed, but is represented. The historical Sima Qian we think we know is the result of this construction. But the distance between this historical person and the Taishigong paratext we cannot bridge, and we do not even understand. To take the Taishigong comments as the voice of the historical Sima Qian, and then to psychologize Sima Qian as the author, strikes me as naive and ultimately untenable. As a paratextual function, the Taishigong is constructed to unify the Shiji as a single text and to guide the reading of that text from one particular perspective. But it also imposes severe limits and opportunity costs on our reading of the text itself. Instead, to read the Shiji in a new light as both history and literature, we must let go of the conflation of historical author and the voice of the historian in the text and paratext. And finally, the paratextual elements of the Shiji that idealize Sima Qian as reader, traveler, observer, listener, both judicious and emotional, not only construct the Sima Qian known to us, they also dramatically stage his textual voice and persona as that of the ideal historian, a deeply human model into which is inscribed a profound exploration and understanding of history, the cosmos, and the human condition for all its readers, including us today, to follow. Thank you very much for your attention.
Let us again express our gratitude to Professor Kern for his wonderful sharing. We'll now move on to the Q&A section of the assembly. May we invite Professor Wiki Zhe to moderate the Q&A section. Professor Zhe, please. Please feel free to have questions for Professor Kern.
Over there? Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Kern, for the inspiring lecture. And the floor is open now. We take questions in person and also online. So we have set the microphone in the middle of the hall. And if any of our colleagues or students have any questions, that you can just use the mic microphone to ask your questions. And also, for those online, for those audience online, we take questions through the Zoom platform. And just send me your questions and I will ask the questions for you. Oh, there's a question. Yeah, could you please, move on to, yes, to the middle of the hall.
Hi, hello, Professor Kern. I have a question like, in the 太史公约 and the 史记, the voice of the historian is constructed to be highly personal and emotional, but in the 汉书, in about 12 chapters of the 汉书, Bangu directly borrowed the 太史公约 and the 史记 to be the 赞约 in the 汉书. How should we understand such phenomenon like the words of the 太史公约 is supposed to be so personal, at least constructed to be so personal, but why did Bangu just directly copy those words?
That's a wonderful question. And it's somewhat also related to the fact that there are all these chapters that Bangu knew could not have been by Sima Qian because they were lost, and they also have the 太史公约. So I think Bangu understood that these were more institutional than personal statements. He didn't take them at face value in the way, for example, Song Dynasty writers would take them, for whom Sima Qian is very important as a person, as a living person who expresses himself, and this is part of Song Dynasty Gu Wen, an ideology. When we recall what Bangu says about the Shiji, he doesn't talk about that question at all. He doesn't talk about Sima Qian as a person. He talks about the fact, and he criticizes the fact, that there is too much fanciful stuff in the Shiji that is unbelievable. Yeah? And so he's very critical of this. But what he finds in the 太史公约 comments, I think, to some extent, and the fact that he simply takes them over and presents them as his own, seemingly as his own, right? Seems to suggest that he understands neither the 太史公约 nor his own 赞约 as personal. Yeah? So we read it this way because we are guided by the tradition to read the Shiji in this way. But the earliest readers read it differently. And I think they understood that this is a rhetorical construction. Yeah? And therefore, that you can take it and pretend it's your own. But you also, in fact, you don't pretend it's your own because you expect your readers to understand that this is a rhetorical construction. Yeah? So in a certain way, this goes pretty well with what I've tried to explain. That we should not confuse all of this as, oh, here's Sima Qian, you know, there's this romantic persona, and he's suffering, and he's crying. And no, not for Bangu. Although, Bangu never cries.
Any other questions? there's another question.
Oh, hello, Professor Kern. I'm a Chinese undergraduate student who is in my final year. But my study field is about the classic text of Taoism. I also want to know more about the history. So the first question of me is about did there any previous case like the Sima Qian, who expressed his personal feeling or personal emotion before Han Dynasty or before Han Wudi, like in 左传春秋, any this case, or is it start from Sima Qian only? And the second reason, and the second question of me is, I want to ask about this case, the reason of this case. Is this only due to the personal experience since Sima Qian have a hard time or difficult time to make him to be a so emotional person when writing this history? Or is it a time trend, the trend of time to invoke people, to let people like Sima Qian write their personal feeling in his history in Han Dynasty? Thank you.
Of course, you have people expressing their emotions in earlier texts, but these people are not the historians. They're not the authors of these texts. They are historical figures who are described in historical narratives everywhere in Sichuan. These people are not robots. They are described as human beings, and often their actions and their imperfect ways, their mistakes, their errors of judgment are described as the result of their feelings. So this is nothing new. Everybody in early China knew about emotions. You can say that the entire philosophy of Xunzi is about how to control those emotions and how to channel them in the right way. Now, what happens in the Western Han in the time of Sima Qian, in the time of Han Wudi? It is mostly within the Shiji that earlier texts are, or that earlier historical figures are described as not only speakers, but writers and authors. And they are described, if you remember this genealogy of suffering authors that I showed in one slide, they're described as people who are driven to speak, driven to write out of suffering. Yeah. And this is then connected to the story of how Sima Qian himself suffers under Emperor Wu, who gives him the choice of suicide or castration. Sima Qian chooses castration so that he can complete his work. But the point is, how do we know all of this? We know this only from two sources. One is the last chapter of the Shiji, and the other is the letter to Renan. We do not know where these sources come from. Maybe this is the historical Sima Qian. But maybe it is not. And if it is not, then what is it? When you look at the biographies of Han intellectuals at the imperial court, so you look at Bangu's Hanshu, you see that being an intellectual at the court, which means being somebody who speaks to the emperor, who advises the emperor, is a dangerous place to be. It's kind of like today. You're always very close to power, but you never have power. And you're always very close to be abused or to be killed or to be banished. Yeah? And the way Han intellectuals, who are the very people who have created these sources for us, yeah, the way they imagine the past, the pre-imperial past, is based on their experiences under the imperial system. So in the Warring States, if you were at one court and that ruler had no use for you or disliked you, you could move on. You go to the next. You had options. Once you are at the imperial capital, you don't have options. There's only one court. And the experience that people had at that one court seemed to be genuine, and they seem to shape the way they think of even pre-imperial China, when people did have options. Yeah. But the way Sima Qian describes earlier, or the Shiji describes earlier historical figures in their suffering, is modeled on Han experiences. It's not the other way around. So for example, I'll give you one example. There is a joint biography by Qu Yuan and Jia Yi. So Jia Yi is this very early Western Han statesman. Jia Yi gets banished because of his honest advice to his emperor. He's banished to the south, to Changsha, in fact. Yeah. So he suffers exactly the same fate as Qu Yuan had suffered, who, according to tradition, had drowned himself in that area, as Sima Qian tells us. Yeah. So you could say Jia Yi is kind of modeled on the example of Qu Yuan. Well, you can also see it exactly the other way around, that the Qu Yuan figure is imagined according to the experiences of a Han intellectual, and that the Qu Yuan biography is shaped in accordance to what Han people experienced. Yeah. Fundamentally, and this is my last comment to your question, fundamentally this is all related to the conditions of being a part of a new class of intellectuals whose only perspective in life is to be at the imperial court. And that's why in the Han, all of this emerges, and all this emotionality emerges in the description of these people.
Hi, Professor Kern. Thanks for your insightful lecture today. In the very first part of your lecture, you mentioned that we can't find any narrative form of the biography is part of Shiji. May I know in what extent this incoherentness of the Shiji is the meaningful historiographic paradigm of the early China historical writing, or just as you said, this incoherentness should concern under the 太史跟乐 part? Yeah.
I'm not entirely sure I understood your question, especially the first part, how you started. Can you maybe repeat that, and maybe I can try to understand it.
Yes, sorry. I remember that in the very first of this lecture, you have mentioned that the 史记 or the 列传 part of the 史记 do not have a coherent or unified
Okay, I get it.
form. Yeah.
Right.
So in this incoherence of the 列传, it is in what extent that is a meaningful paradigm of historical writing, or just this incoherence should co-construct with the 太史公约 to synthesize a unified historical work.
Yeah, now I understand it. Thank you for helping me. Now, not all 列传 are incoherent. Some are. Some are highly incoherent, and I mentioned the 3 examples of the 孔子世家 and then the Quyuan and Laozi biographies. What we find in these biographies is, when we read them very carefully, we find that they are composed from different mutually independent sources. So they are patched together from different materials. The Quyuan biography cannot even agree with itself on the name of the protagonist, whether it's Quyuan or Quping. It starts out with Quping and then it turns to Quyuan, which may be the same person, but in that case, it comes from 2 different sources, and it's not harmonized by the historian. It's left kind of in its raw state. Yeah? Now, what does that reflect? That reflects the very fact that, number 1, the 史记 is compiled from probably hundreds of different sources. Scholars have, in fact, identified dozens and dozens of sources. But of course, normally, the 史记 doesn't tell you its sources. Yeah? But you have to imagine somebody sitting in front of a huge pile of bamboo slips of all sorts that come from all sorts of places and tell all sorts of stories. And somebody, probably not one person, but a whole group of people, try to arrange them and try to combine them into meaningful stories. Stories or books in early China did not exist as books that we know, like long texts of hundreds of pages with a beginning and an end. They existed and circulated in much smaller units. A chapter of what is later a book we can find in bamboo slips today. We never find a book. Or a single song can be a unit, or a paragraph can be a unit, or an anecdote, a historical anecdote can be a unit. So Zuozhuan as well is compiled of a great variety of source materials from different places. Yeah? And so, indeed, this is a common phenomenon in early China. When you read all the Zhuzi, the philosophers, they're all compiled from smaller units. Yeah? So this is nothing new with Sima Qian, or with the 史记. And I think this speaks to some extent also to a general lack of emphasis on authoring and creating texts, and a greater emphasis on compiling texts, putting them together in the way the 史记 is put together. So to a large extent, the 史记 is not the text written by one person. It's a text that is compiled, and probably not by one person, but by many people from a large number of sources.
Thank you.
Because of the time, I'm afraid that we can only take one more question. Yes. Sorry. Yes, it's you, please.
Hi, Professor. Actually, my question is quite amateur, I have to say. We have to admit that Shiji is very, well, meaningful to Chinese people. Then what do you think is the most important quality in Shiji for the Chinese people nowadays and for the world? Thank you.
It's a difficult question, right? But I like it that you emphasize the word nowadays, because the Shiji really meant very different things to different people at different times. Our reading of the Shiji today is fundamentally a reading that was invented in the Song dynasty, in the northern Song, the Bei Song, by people like Ouyang Xiu. And why is the Shiji important to us today, or to what you call the Chinese people? Although I think there is a great variety of people, and they're not just one group. I think for two reasons. One, it's for a lot of early history our only source. Just as Zhou Zhuan is our only source for Chunqiu history, almost our only source. Yeah. So whether we believe everything that's in there or not, the problem is we have nothing else. And so the Shiji gives us a framework of ancient Chinese history. This is important. This is important to different people for different reasons. If you would like to make the case that China today is a global superpower, politically, militarily, economically, you have every good reason to say it has a deep history. And then a book like Shiji is important to document the antiquity of China as a central, huge power in the world. And that is where the legitimacy of China in the world comes from. It comes from its history. It doesn't come from the fact that it has a lot of people, or it is rich, or it has a big military. That doesn't provide legitimacy. Yeah? Legitimacy comes from history. So in one way, you can say it's an extremely political meaning, why it's important. But that's not the importance for everybody in China. There are lots of people who read the Shiji today as an expression of, here is one man's voice who suffers. And where people find themselves in that voice and find themselves in the paradigms that are described by that voice. And the most important of all these paradigms, let me tell you, is not Kongzi, it's Qu-Yuan. For the last 2,000 years, thousands and thousands of Chinese intellectuals, they get up in the morning, they don't feel well, they look in the mirror, and they see Qu-Yuan. And that's the Qu-Yuan that Sima Qian has given us. Yeah. So it means different things to different people for different reasons. And I think this is why the text is so successful, why we are still reading Sima Qian, because we can all read Sima Qian in different ways. And every generation finds its own ways to do that. And that is the definition of a classic. The definition of a classic, according to the wonderful Italian author Italo Calvino, is a classic is a text that has never finished saying what it has to say. And that's the Shiji.
Thank you, thank you.
Thank you, Professor Kern. And this is the end of this session. And thanks again, Professor Kern, to stay with us. We have the third session of the Qianmu lecture in History and Culture tomorrow at the Central Library at Causeway Bay. we look forward to that.
Thank you very much.
Once again, thank you.